This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Amira sat alone in the cafeteria, the murmur of chatter and the clatter of trays filling the air around her. She had grown accustomed to the noise, the bustling activity, the laughter of her classmates as they gathered in groups. But in the sea of faces, hers was the one that stood out unwanted, unwelcome, a shadow among the bright, the popular, the ones who belonged. She had long since stopped trying to fit in, accepting the fact that she would never be part of their world, never be one of them. As the other girls chatted in cliques and the boys cracked jokes at the lunch table, Amira's gaze wandered to the corner of the room, to the place where she always sat at a table by the window, away from the crowd. She would never be like them, like Tiffany or Jessica or anyone else in her class. They were a world unto themselves, and she, in her hijab, in her long sleeves, in her foreignness, was an outsider. It had been like this since her first day at Central High School, when she was just a freshman. At first she had hoped that the whispers and stares would fade away with time, but they didn't. It was as if the moment she had walked into the hallways, everyone had known exactly who she was, exactly what she represented. She wasn't from Texas, she wasn't from their world, and she wasn't one of them. She was different, and to the students at Central, that was enough. The isolation began early, a quiet but insistent rejection that festered in the background of her life. She hadn't known how to deal with it at first, how to react to the sly glances and the whispered comments. It was like being surrounded by a thick wall of glass. She could see them, hear them, but they could never hear her, never see her for who she was. They only saw the hijab, the dark skin, the foreign accent, the otherness. The bullying started small. It was just a few words here and there, mocking comments about her clothes, her religion, the way she spoke. A few jabs at her headscarf, a few giggles as she walked by. But with every year, it grew more intense, more open, more malicious. By the time Amira reached her junior year, the bullying had become an almost constant presence in her life, a cruel undertow pulling at her sense of self. Her classmates had learned to use her difference as a weapon, a reason to target her with everything they had. It was subtle at first. Tiffany, the popular girl who always sat in the front of the classroom, would send her passive-aggressive smiles when Amira tried to answer a question. When Amira gave a presentation, Tiffany would whisper to her friends, her laughter like knives cutting into the silence. The others would join in, throwing looks of disdain and mocking glances her way. Amira could feel their eyes on her, the way they assessed her, dissected her like some kind of exotic specimen. She was the girl with the funny name, the funny accent, the strange clothes. But it wasn't just the girls. The boys, too, had their part to play. They would make lewd jokes when she walked by, snicker behind their hands as she passed. They'd call her terrorist under their breath, or ISIS sympathizer, and laugh as if they had made some brilliant joke. At first, Amira tried to ignore them, tried to pretend that it didn't hurt, that their words didn't sting. But the whispers grew louder, the laughter more frequent. Every day it felt like a new wound was carved into her, a new cut that was so deep it left her gasping for air. She couldn't escape it. The hallways, the classrooms, the lunchroom, they all felt like a prison, and she was locked inside, the walls closing in with every passing day. In the classroom, it was no better. The teachers, well-meaning but oblivious, never seemed to notice what was happening. They would ask her to speak in class, and when she did, the others would make fun of her accent, mock the way her voice faltered. They would roll their eyes when she spoke up in discussions, whispering to each other that Amira only ever seemed to talk about foreign things, always her religion, always the Middle East, always something that didn't fit into their narrow view of the world. It became unbearable. She would retreat into herself, keeping quiet, her head down, her mind a swirling mess of loneliness. She stopped raising her hand, stopped answering questions. Why bother? Nothing she said seemed to matter anyway. The students who once had the decency to ignore her now seemed to find pleasure in pushing her buttons, in forcing her to feel more and more alien. But it wasn't just the verbal cruelty. There were the physical acts of aggression, the deliberate actions meant to humiliate her. Sometimes it was something as small as a paper being thrown at the back of her head in the middle of class. Other times it was worse. Once, in the hallway between classes, someone shoved her into the lockers. Amira had stumbled, her books falling to the floor, and as she scrambled to pick them up, Tiffany had come up from behind her and yanked her hijab off her head, laughing as the other students around her joined in. For a moment, Amira had frozen, feeling the cold rush of humiliation. Her hair, loose and tangled, fell around her shoulders and she felt exposed, vulnerable. When she tried to pull the hijab back, Tiffany pushed her away, taunting her with words that were like daggers. "You don't belong here," Amira, she had sneered, her voice dripping with scorn. "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" That moment lingered in Amira's mind, like a poison seeping into her thoughts. The humiliation, the laughter, the coldness, it was too much. She had run to the bathroom, tears streaming down her face, and locked herself in a stall, holding herself together as best as she could. The memory of that incident haunted her every day after. She no longer felt safe at school. Every hallway felt like a trap, every classroom a stage where she was the unwilling performer. Even the smallest interactions were laced with cruelty. A forgotten pencil in the hallway became an excuse for a cruel joke. A comment about her faith turned into a reason to laugh. It was as if her classmates had decided she was nothing more than a target for their cruelty, a game they played every day. But the worst part wasn't the bullying itself, it was the silence. The silence of the teachers who didn't intervene, the silence of the other students who didn't speak up. No one cared, no one saw her. Amira had tried to reach out once, confiding in a teacher about the things she was enduring, but the teacher had only offered empty platitudes, saying that things would get better. They always said that, didn't they? Things would get better. But they never did. They never got better. They only got worse. Amira's isolation deepened. Her world became smaller, confined to the walls of her bedroom, the quiet space where she could escape into her own mind. She stopped going out, stopped meeting her classmates after school, stopped pretending that she was fine. The anger inside her swelled. But it was a quiet anger, the kind that didn't show on the outside. On the outside, she was the quiet, obedient Muslim girl, the one who wore her hijab with pride, the one who smiled politely but never spoke too much. But inside, there was a storm brewing. It was the kind of storm that could tear everything apart. Amira could feel it gathering, feel it building within her, and for the first time in years she began to think of a way out. Not the kind of escape she had dreamed of before, an escape from the stares, from the ridicule. No, this time she began to think of something darker, something more final. She began to think of retribution. And so the bullying continued. Every word, every look, every act of cruelty added to the weight that pressed down on her, until the moment would come when she could no longer bear it. The seeds of rage had been planted, and with every passing day they grew deeper, feeding off the pain of her past, until they became something she could no longer ignore. The psychological toll of the relentless bullying began to seep into Amira's every thought and action like a slow, poisonous drip. It was a constant presence, one she could never shake off. From the moment she woke up in the morning to the sound of her alarm buzzing through her bedroom, to the very last thoughts she had before closing her eyes at night, it was there gnawing at the edges of her mind. She had once tried to be strong, to brush off the cruel taunts, to wear a mask of indifference. But now everything felt like a weight, a burden too heavy to carry. Every morning was an internal battle. The first hurdle was always the thought of school, of the people waiting there. Amira no longer saw the institution as a place of learning. It had become a battleground, a place where she fought to hold on to whatever fragments of her identity and self-worth she had left. She would wake up early, staring at the ceiling for long minutes, as if searching for some strength, some reason to face the day. But it always felt pointless. Her classmates, the very same people who were supposed to be her peers, had long since turned her existence into a joke. And now the thought of facing them again filled her with a deep, gnawing dread. It wasn't just the ridicule, it was the isolation, the crushing weight of being made to feel invisible yet simultaneously the center of their cruel attention. Amira had always been the quiet type, introverted, preferring to keep to herself. But this was different. She no longer wanted to be quiet. She wanted to scream. She wanted to scream at the world, at the people who didn't understand her, who refused to even try. But she couldn't. Her voice had become so small, so insignificant in her own mind, that the act of raising it, of calling for help, seemed impossible. The torment was like an invisible storm raging inside her, one that no one else could see, no one else could feel, but one that threatened to break her apart from within. Every step she took toward school felt like stepping deeper into a suffocating void. Her heart raced, her stomach twisted into knots, and her breath would catch in her throat. The first few years of bullying had been disorienting, but now they had taken on a rhythmic, oppressive quality. Amira had become hyper-aware of every interaction, every exchange. She could feel the sting of each glance, hear the whispers that were meant for her, but that no one had the courage to say aloud. It wasn't just the words that cut, it was the silence. The way people looked at her as if she were some kind of alien, something that didn't belong in their world. Every time a group of students passed by her in the hallways, Amira could feel their eyes on her, the way they eyed her with a mixture of pity and distaste. She knew what they were thinking. What is she doing here? Why doesn't she go back to where she came from? It wasn't just the social isolation that was eating away at her, it was the emotional toll it took. The sadness had morphed into something darker. The anger, which had once seemed like a fleeting emotion, had become a constant companion. It boiled beneath the surface of her every interaction, quiet yet suffocating. She would try to focus on the lessons, on the words the teachers were saying, but her mind would always wander back to those moments of humiliation, those incidents where her classmates had made her feel small and powerless. They replayed in her mind like an endless loop, each insult, each slap in the face, each whispered joke, all of them twisting in her head, over and over again, as if they were etched into her very soul. Her home life offered no refuge. Her family, well-intentioned but distant, couldn't understand what she was going through. They knew the bullying existed, of course, but they dismissed it. They didn't see it as a threat, as something capable of destroying a person from the inside. To them, it was just a phase, something every teenager went through. They had no way of understanding how it felt to walk into school every day knowing that the world was against you. To them, Amira's identity, her hijab, her name, her accent was a source of pride, a testament to the strength of their culture. But to the other students, it was just a reminder that she didn't belong. And so she retreated further into herself. The once bright girl who had loved to read, to explore the world through books, had become a ghost, her world shrinking smaller with each passing day. She no longer cared about her grades, no longer cared about the future. Every achievement, every goal felt hollow, like a meaningless gesture in a world that had no place for her. Her friends, the few she had left, had begun to fade away as well. They too had grown uncomfortable with the situation. They didn't want to be associated with the girl who was constantly the target of jokes, the one who was always on the receiving end of taunts. They began to distance themselves from her, subtly, slowly, until she was left alone. It wasn't just the emotional isolation that was destroying Amira. It was the way the bullying had begun to seep into her very sense of self. She no longer recognized the person staring back at her in the mirror. The girl she saw was fragile, broken, and defeated. The hijab she once wore with pride had become a symbol of her pain. She would catch herself looking at it in the mirror, wishing she could take it off, wishing she could become invisible, wishing she could disappear altogether. But no matter how much she wanted to hide from the world, she knew she couldn't. The world had already marked her, already made her a target. No amount of hiding could change that. Sleep, too, had become a struggle. Every night, she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of her room pressing in on her. Her thoughts would race, her mind spiraling into darker and darker places. The anger, the isolation, the hopelessness, they all tangled together, forming a knot in her chest that she couldn't untangle. It was as if her emotions had become an uncontainable force, one that she couldn't control, couldn't stop. Sometimes she would think of just disappearing. Sometimes she would think of running away, of leaving the town, leaving everything behind. But there was nowhere to go, no place that could offer her peace, no place where she wouldn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. It wasn't just the torment of the school that was eating at her, it was the realization that she was invisible, that the world saw her as a burden, a nuisance, a strange, unwanted element in their perfect, polished lives. She could never be like them. She could never fit in. Her faith, her culture, her very existence had become the reason for her suffering. The realization that the world would never see her as human, never accept her as part of it, was suffocating. And so as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Amira's mind began to fracture. The sadness became a constant, like a heavy blanket that smothered everything she once loved. The anger no longer felt like an emotion, it had become her identity, her fuel. She had spent so long trying to ignore it, trying to suppress it, but it was always there, eating away at her, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. The thoughts of revenge, once fleeting, became more frequent, more vivid. She could picture the faces of those who had tormented her, the ones who had made her life a nightmare. She could picture the looks on their faces, the fear in their eyes, as she made them understand finally what it felt like to be powerless, to be helpless. Her world had shrunk, her mind had darkened, and the storm inside her had become unbearable. There was no escape, no way out. And as the days wore on, Amira began to wonder if the only way to free herself, to free her mind from this torment, was to make the world feel what she had felt for so long. To make them understand the pain, the isolation, the crushing weight of being invisible, the weight of being broken. The storm was coming, and Amira could feel it, rising within her, unstoppable. The planning had started slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a quiet whisper in the back of Amira's mind. In the beginning, it wasn't a coherent thought or a concrete idea, it was more of an impulse, a seed planted in the fertile ground of her anger and despair. But as the days dragged on and the cruelty from her classmates intensified, that seed began to grow, its roots sinking deeper into her psyche, feeding off the years of torment and isolation. Slowly, the thought of retribution became an obsession, a plan that over time took shape in her mind, a dark and twisted vision of revenge. At first, the idea was simply a fantasy, an escape from the crushing weight of her daily existence. She imagined herself walking through the hallways of Central High School, her head held high, free from the mocking stares, free from the cruel jokes, free from the pain that had defined her life for so long. In these fantasies, she was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. She was powerful, in control, and the world around her was forced to reckon with her existence. But fantasies, Amira soon realized, were not enough. The rage inside her was too consuming, the pain too real, and the desire for revenge too strong to remain merely a dream. And so the planning began. It wasn't sudden, it was a gradual process, a slow unfolding of the twisted path that Amira would eventually take. The first step was the realization that she couldn't go on living in this way. The constant bullying, the isolation, the humiliation, it was destroying her, eating her alive. She was no longer content to suffer in silence. She would make them feel what she felt. But to do that, she needed a plan. She needed to be strategic. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She had spent so many years being invisible to them, being dismissed, that the idea of finally making them pay for everything they had done to her felt like the only way to assert her existence. Amira began by quietly observing her classmates. She watched their routines, their habits, the way they moved through the school. She took note of their schedules, the places they frequented during lunch, the spots where they congregated after school. It was all so simple, so predictable. They were creatures of habit, and that was her advantage. They didn't know it, but they had become part of her plan. The people who had tormented her, who had made her feel less than human, had given her all the information she needed without even realizing it. For weeks, Amira kept to herself. She withdrew further from her classmates, no longer participating in any class discussions, no longer attempting to engage in the school's social environment. She was a shadow, unnoticed, left to watch from the edges. But while everyone thought she was simply retreating into her shell, she was actually studying them. She watched Tiffany and Jessica, the ringleaders of the bullying, noting their movements, their weaknesses, the ways in which they interacted with each other. She paid special attention to the group's leaders, those who had hurt her the most. She knew their routines inside and out, their lunch schedules, the places they hung out after school, the areas of the school that they frequented. She also began to study the security systems at Central High. It wasn't difficult. There were cameras in the hallways, and a few in the main corridors, but none in the classrooms. There were a few cameras in the parking lot, but nothing inside the school could be monitored in real time. The security guards were relaxed, their attention often distracted by their phones or small talk with staff. Amira had noticed this early on, and it gave her an unsettling sense of relief. This school, despite its size, was vulnerable. It was a ticking time bomb, its flaws overlooked by the very people who were supposed to keep everyone safe. It was a place where rules were bent, where routines were followed mindlessly, and that made it the perfect target. With this knowledge, Amira began to think about the timing of her plan. She knew she had to choose the right moment, one where the school would be busy enough to ensure maximum impact, but not so crowded that she would be overwhelmed. It had to be a time when her classmates would be most vulnerable, most exposed. The plan took shape over weeks, each day building on the last. She would strike during lunch hour, when everyone was in the cafeteria or hanging out in the common areas. There would be no escape then. It was a moment when the students were relaxed, complacent, their guard down. Amira's thoughts turned darker as the weeks passed. She wasn't just planning revenge, she was planning a statement, a way to make sure that the torment she had suffered would be remembered. The school had never taken her seriously, had never even bothered to stop the bullying. This was her way of forcing them to see her, to acknowledge her existence, to realize the depth of the pain they had caused her. She didn't just want to hurt them, she wanted them to understand. She wanted to be their nightmare, their reckoning. She began to make preparations in secret, always mindful of the risks, always careful to cover her tracks. She'd been researching for months, looking into the best ways to inflict maximum damage with the least amount of effort. She knew she didn't have to be violent in the traditional sense. She could be strategic, calculating. She didn't want to be caught, didn't want to leave any trace of herself behind. The key to her success was precision, and precision would require preparation. Amira began to collect items she could use for her plan. It wasn't difficult to find things she could hide away, things like knives, small explosives, or chemicals. Each item was carefully selected, each choice deliberate. She would slip into stores after school, buying what she needed with cash, ensuring that nothing could be traced back to her. She never once thought of the consequences. Her mind was consumed by the need for revenge, the desire to see her classmates squirm as they realized that their tormentor was no longer the shy, invisible girl they could walk all over. She had thought long and hard about how she would carry out the plan. It had to be fast, ruthless, and efficient. The first few moments would be the most critical. She had to move quickly before anyone had time to react, before anyone could call for help. There could be no hesitation. Every action had to be measured, every step taken with cold precision. Amira knew she couldn't afford to falter. She couldn't allow herself to doubt the plan now, not after everything she had endured. There was no turning back. Her mind raced as she envisioned the scene unfolding. It would be chaotic, but that was the point. She imagined the panic, the confusion, the desperate scramble for safety. She imagined the faces of her tormentors, their disbelief, their fear as they realized that the girl they had spent years tormenting was finally getting her revenge. It was the ultimate revenge, the one that would be impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. And for once, Amira would not be invisible. She would be the one everyone feared. In the weeks that followed, Amira's demeanor began to change. She no longer flinched at the sight of her classmates, no longer felt the sting of their words or their laughter. Her anger had solidified into something colder, something more purposeful. Her eyes were no longer filled with sadness or fear, they were filled with determination. She walked the halls of Central High with a strange sense of calm, the knowledge that she was in control. The plan was nearly complete. It was just a matter of time. The day of the event arrived like an inevitable storm, a thunderous presence on the horizon that could no longer be avoided. Amira had prepared for it meticulously, every detail locked in her mind, every action rehearsed in secret. The heavy weight of anticipation hung in the air, a constant pressure in her chest as she walked through the halls of Central High. Her footsteps were steady, deliberate, though on the inside, her heart beat erratically, each thud reverberating in her ears. She had reached the moment of no return. This was the point of finality, the apex of everything she had suffered, and there was no way back. As the lunch bell rang, signaling the end of the morning classes, Amira slipped into the crowded hallways, her heart rate slowing to a methodical rhythm. The chaos that typically followed the bell was a comforting sound to her ears. It was a sound of normalcy, of a world unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. The school was bustling with students, the hallways thick with noise and movement. Everyone was either rushing to the cafeteria, chatting in groups, or heading outside for a break. No one noticed her. She had blended in perfectly, the quiet, invisible girl who no one ever thought to keep an eye on. Amira's eyes darted over the crowd, focusing on her targets, her classmates, her tormentors. They were everywhere, scattered across the school, oblivious to the storm she had been quietly brewing. Tiffany and Jessica, the main orchestrators of her torment, were already seated at their usual table in the cafeteria, laughing and chatting with their friends. They had no idea that today they would never laugh again. She passed through the halls without drawing attention to herself, her steps quick but calculated. She was moving like a shadow, invisible to everyone around her. She passed by the security guard, who was lazily watching a game on his phone. The cameras, which normally followed every movement, seemed to blur into the background. Amira had already disabled the few that mattered earlier that morning. The school's layout was a maze she knew all too well. Every corner, every door, every exit, she knew them all. Nothing was left to chance. Once she reached the back door of the cafeteria, she paused. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. She inhaled deeply, savoring the moment of stillness before the chaos began. This was the calm before the storm. She reached into the bag at her side, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the weapon she had concealed inside. She took another deep breath, checked her watch no more than a minute, until the chaos would ensue. The plan was simple, swift, calculated, with no room for mistakes. The element of surprise was everything. She stepped inside the cafeteria, unnoticed by the clusters of students seated at tables, chatting and laughing. The food lines were long, the noise overwhelming. For a brief moment it felt almost ordinary, as if this could be just another day. But as her eyes scanned the room, locking onto her targets, she felt a calmness wash over her. It wasn't fear anymore, it was control. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and now it was here, unfolding before her eyes like a nightmare come to life. Amira moved to the center of the room, her pace quickening as the plan took its first step. She could hear the conversations, the hum of activity, but it all felt distant, as if she were submerged underwater. She was focused only on the immediate task at hand. She reached the far corner of the cafeteria, where Tiffany and Jessica sat, and without hesitation she pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, echoing through the room, but it was swallowed up by the frantic screams that immediately followed. Chaos erupted as students scrambled to the floor, diving under tables, knocking over chairs, their faces twisted in terror. It took only a moment for the whole room to realize what was happening. Amira, the quiet girl, the one they had tormented for so long, was standing there, her eyes cold, her expression emotionless. She had become the monster they feared, the embodiment of every cruel joke, every whispered insult. The first shot hit its mark, Tiffany's shocked expression frozen in place as she crumpled to the floor. The room exploded into pandemonium, but Amira didn't flinch. She moved with a chilling calmness, walking deliberately to the next table, her movements swift, calculating. She fired again, and Jessica collapsed in a heap, her body twitching violently before going still. Screams filled the air as the students scrambled to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The exits were blocked, and the security guards, those few who had been stationed in the cafeteria, were paralyzed with fear, unsure of how to respond. No one was prepared for this, not the teachers, not the staff, and certainly not the students who had lived their lives thinking they were invincible, untouchable. Amira moved through the cafeteria like a predator, methodical, efficient. She didn't waste time. She had already decided who would live and who would die, and the ones who had been part of her torment were now the targets of her wrath. She fired shot after shot, her eyes never leaving her victims. Her hands, though steady, had begun to feel cold, almost numb. This wasn't real, she thought. This was a dream, a nightmare that she had somehow conjured up to make herself feel powerful. But it wasn't a dream. It was happening, and there was no turning back now. The tables were overturned, students were screaming, pushing and shoving to escape, but Amira's eyes were focused only on the ones who had made her life hell. She didn't need to look at the faces of the others, she knew who they were, who had been complicit in her pain. She felt no pity, no hesitation. They had done this to her, and now they would pay. As the bodies of her classmates fell to the ground, their lifeless forms a grim testament to her fury, Amira felt something strange, a cold satisfaction, a numbness that filled the hollow void inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel weak. She didn't feel like the helpless, invisible girl who had been pushed around. For the first time, she felt like she had control. She was the one who had the power now, the power to make them feel everything she had felt. But as the gunfire ceased, the room grew eerily silent, save for the ragged breaths of the survivors and the distant wail of sirens. Amira stood there, surrounded by the bodies of her classmates, a sea of destruction in her wake. Her chest heaved with exertion, her fingers trembling on the gun, but her mind was eerily calm. She had done it. She had carried out the plan. She had made them pay. And yet, as the adrenaline began to ebb, a creeping sense of emptiness washed over her. The satisfaction she had expected to feel, the catharsis she had imagined, was fleeting. The world around her seemed distant, unreal. The faces of her classmates, now lifeless on the floor, blurred together in her vision, as if they no longer mattered. The finality of it all hit her like a tidal wave. She had done what she had set out to do, but in the quiet aftermath she realized something unsettling. It was over, but so was she. There was no going back. The room was filled with silence now, broken only by the distant sound of sirens growing louder. In the end, Amira wasn't sure what was worse, the emptiness that followed or the realization that she would never again be the person she once was. The aftermath of the massacre was nothing short of nightmarish, the consequences unfurling in a slow-motion spiral of horror and chaos. Amira had left the scene in the same detached manner in which she had carried out her plan, cold, calculated, and devoid of any lingering sentiment. But what awaited her outside the bloodied walls of the cafeteria was far more harrowing than anything she had anticipated. The world had not collapsed into the peace she thought she would find. Instead, it seemed to close in on her, a suffocating weight pressing on her chest as she realized the full extent of what she had just done. As she left the cafeteria, the first sirens could be heard wailing in the distance. The air seemed to freeze, caught in an eerie stillness, as though the world was holding its breath. She could already hear the chaos behind her, the shrill cries of the surviving students, the shuffling of feet as they scrambled to find cover, the frantic calls to 911. None of it registered as real at first. The adrenaline was still rushing through her veins, dulling the horror of what she had just witnessed. But with each step she took, the weight of her actions began to settle in, a slow realization creeping up her spine. She moved quickly, her legs carrying her away from the scene with a sense of urgency she didn't fully understand. There was no plan for what came next. She had orchestrated the carnage, but in the silence that followed, the reality of escape, of facing the consequences, loomed like a dark shadow that could not be outrun. She had done what she had set out to do, but now the question was, could she live with it? Would she even have the chance to? The school had descended into a state of abject terror. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks began to flood the campus, the sound of their arrival cutting through the air like a scream. Officers swarmed the building, weapons drawn, sweeping through the hallways in search of the perpetrator, the shooter who had caused this nightmare. Their radios crackled with fragmented reports, images of the horror within the school slowly leaking out into the outside world. The media would soon follow, turning the tragedy into a spectacle, dissecting every detail of the massacre, every clue they could find. But at that moment there was only confusion, panic, and the desperate search for answers. Inside the cafeteria, the chaos was impossible to fully comprehend. The bodies of the fallen students lay sprawled across the floor, their faces contorted in terror and disbelief, their lives snuffed out in an instant. The air was thick with blood, the stench of gunpowder lingering in the corners of the room. Some students had managed to flee, hiding in bathrooms or locked classrooms, while others lay paralyzed, unable to move. The wounded cried out for help, their pleas lost in the overwhelming noise of the emergency response. Medics rushed in, trying to stabilize the injured, their hands trembling as they worked on the broken bodies of their classmates, many of whom would never walk again. The survivors, those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand, were left to grapple with the trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some of them would remember Amira's cold eyes, the way she had moved through the room with chilling precision, striking down her enemies without hesitation. Others would try to block out the memory altogether, to pretend that it had never happened, to convince themselves that it was all a nightmare they could wake from. But no one would leave that day unscathed. Some would carry the physical scars, others the mental ones. But all would be forever changed. The police were quick to secure the building, sealing off the exits and ensuring that no one could leave without being questioned. News outlets swarmed to the scene, helicopters circling overhead, capturing the unfolding tragedy in real time. They reported the number of dead, the number of wounded, the names of the victims. All of it was broadcasted for the world to see. The reporters spoke of Amira in hushed tones, her name whispered like some kind of whispered curse. The quiet, shy Muslim girl who had been ignored, taunted, and bullied had now become the center of the world's attention. But for all the media attention, no one knew the full story. No one understood the depth of her pain, the darkness that had driven her to commit such a horrific act. In the following days, the shockwaves of the event spread far beyond the walls of Central High. The police conducted an exhaustive search for Amira, but she was already long gone. The authorities initially thought she had fled the state, that she had vanished into thin air. But in reality, she was still there, in the city of San Antonio, trying to keep her head down and her thoughts numb. She had taken refuge in the shadows, her only companions the haunting images of the massacre she had just left behind. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving her with a suffocating emptiness, the weight of her actions crashing down on her like an avalanche. She had known what she was doing, had prepared for it, but nothing had prepared her for the aftermath. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into the massacre continued relentlessly. The media painted her as a monster, a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. Her family was left to grapple with the unfathomable grief of losing a daughter in such a violent, senseless way. They couldn't comprehend how the sweet girl they had raised had become a murderer. They struggled with the flood of emotions: shock, disbelief, guilt, shame. And though they had always known Amira was quiet and withdrawn, they had never imagined she could harbor such deep, consuming rage. In the classrooms of Central High, students returned to the halls, but things were never the same. The fear and paranoia that followed the event poisoned every corner of the school. People looked at each other with suspicion, unsure of who might snap next, unsure of who might carry out the next attack. Teachers were nervous. unsure how to continue teaching in a place where the violence had touched everyone. The atmosphere was thick with grief and confusion, as if the very air had become poisoned by what had transpired. The families of the victims mourned their losses in private, their lives shattered by the brutal killings of their children. No one could fully process the gravity of what had happened. The funeral services were held, each one a grim reminder of the fragile nature of life, of how quickly everything could be taken away. Amira's actions had left a permanent scar on the entire community, one that could never be erased. The town of San Antonio would never be the same. As for Amira, she disappeared into the shadows, her whereabouts unknown. Authorities continued to search, but it was as if she had evaporated into thin air. The search for her became a haunting pursuit. The one question that lingered in the minds of everyone who had been touched by the event: where was she now? Had she gone into hiding? Was she preparing for another attack? Or had she simply disappeared, lost in a world that had consumed her so completely? No one knew. All they could do was wait for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place, wait for the inevitable conclusion to a story that had only just begun. And as the world moved on, the memory of the massacre at Central High would live on, a dark stain on the community, a reminder of the horrors that could arise from years of bullying, neglect, and suffering. The legacy of the massacre at Central High would not fade with time. Instead, it grew stronger, more haunting, like a dark cloud that hung over the town of San Antonio. As months passed, the event became an indelible scar on the collective consciousness, a shadow that stretched far beyond the walls of the school and into every corner of the community. The violence of that day, the horror that had unfolded in the cafeteria, lingered in the air, filling the streets, the schools, and the minds of the people who had been left behind. For the families of the victims, the legacy was one of grief and unimaginable loss. Parents who had once sent their children to school with the hope of a bright future now found themselves in a perpetual state of mourning. The victims' names were etched into the memories of those who had known them, their faces frozen in photographs that no one could bear to look at anymore. Each year, the anniversary of the massacre brought with it waves of sorrow, as if the pain was freshly inflicted with every passing moment. In the quiet of their homes, they wondered if they could ever truly heal, if they could ever forget the chaos of that day. But they knew deep down that the answer was no. The loss was permanent. Their children were gone, and nothing would ever make it right. The community itself struggled to understand what had happened. The initial shock had given way to anger, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. News reports continued to circulate, showing images of the carnage, the police interviews, the statements from survivors. Every angle was dissected, every possibility explored, but no one could fully explain how a girl, someone who had once seemed so quiet, so invisible, had erupted in such fury. The news outlets covered the tragedy as a story of a mental breakdown. But the truth was far more complex than the neatly packaged narrative they offered. There was no simple explanation, no easy answer. Amira's motives were scrutinized, debated, and misinterpreted, but no one could truly understand the depth of her pain or the torment that had driven her to that point. As the investigation into the event continued, the school itself became a place of fear and uncertainty. Students who had survived the massacre carried the weight of it with them every day. The memories of that day, of the gunshots, the screams, the blood, never left them. They were haunted by the faces of their fallen friends, by the moment when time had stopped, when everything they had known had been shattered. They tried to go on with their lives, tried to find some semblance of normalcy, but the truth was that normalcy had been stolen from them. They could never walk through the hallways of Central High without feeling the presence of those lost that day, a silent reminder of the darkness that had taken root in their school. The school's reputation, once a source of pride for the community, was forever tarnished. Central High became synonymous with violence, with tragedy, with the horror that Amira had unleashed. It was no longer a place where students dreamed of a future. It was a place of death, of fear, of trauma. Parents pulled their children from the school, fearing that it was no longer safe. Enrollment numbers dropped, and the administration scrambled to rebuild what had been destroyed. But it was impossible to erase the legacy. No amount of counseling, no number of new policies, could erase the memory of what had happened in that cafeteria. In the years that followed, the massacre would become part of a grim history. It would be taught in history classes as a cautionary tale about bullying and its consequences. Amira's name, once a quiet whisper in the halls, became a symbol of vengeance, of a system that had failed her. Some saw her as a martyr, a victim of a society that had driven her to the edge. Others viewed her as a monster, a killer who had crossed the line between justice and madness. The truth, however, was much murkier. Amira was neither hero nor villain. She was a tragic figure caught in the gears of a broken system that had left her with no options, no way out but violence. For the surviving students, the legacy was one of psychological scars. Those who had witnessed the carnage found it impossible to escape the images that haunted them at night. Sleep became a rare commodity, and the walls of their homes seemed to close in on them with every passing day. Many of them sought therapy, trying to piece together their shattered lives, but no amount of counseling could undo the damage. Some turned to drugs, alcohol, or worse, attempting to numb the pain of what they had experienced. Others became withdrawn, unable to trust anyone, their relationships forever marked by the trauma they had endured. Even years later, many of the survivors still carried the weight of that day with them, an invisible burden that no one could see but everyone could feel. The legacy of the massacre also reached the larger community, spreading like a virus. People in San Antonio became wary of each other, suspicious of the quiet, the withdrawn, the seemingly normal individuals who walked among them. The tragedy sparked debates about gun control, mental health, and the culture of bullying in schools. Politicians took to the airwaves, offering empty promises and platitudes, but nothing concrete changed. The cycle of violence continued, as if nothing could break the endless chain of suffering. Amira's actions became part of the broader conversation about societal decay, about the alienation of youth, about the ways in which schools and families failed to provide support to those in need. In time, the story of Amira and the massacre faded from the daily news cycle, replaced by new tragedies, new headlines, new victims. But it never truly went away. Her story lingered, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. Parents spoke of her to their children as a warning, a grim reminder of what could happen when a person was pushed too far. And the survivors, those who had lived through the nightmare, could never fully escape her legacy. It haunted them in the dark moments, in the quiet spaces where they had once felt safe. They lived with the knowledge that the line between victim and perpetrator could blur so easily, that the quietest, most invisible people could hide the deepest pain. Amira's legacy was not one of redemption or justice, it was one of destruction, of lives torn apart, of futures ruined. It was a reminder that the wounds inflicted by cruelty and indifference could fester, grow, and eventually explode in a violent, tragic eruption. The consequences of her actions rippled out far beyond the walls of Central High, leaving an indelible mark on the world. And no matter how much time passed, that mark would never fade. The darkness she had unleashed could not be undone, and the world would never be the same because of it.